Hi, this is Troy Hubble from Your Dyslexia Expert. I don't have a great nerdism today. I am reading Brandon Sanderson's books again. If you have never read Brandon Sanderson, I strongly recommend him if you are a fantasy or a sci-fi fan. But again, we're not here to talk about the books that I like. We are here to talk about dyslexia. And for Dyslexia Awareness Month, I am going to address another myth. This one might be a little bit controversial, so I'll ask you if you have some history of thinking about reading in one of the ways in which we're going to describe. Try to keep an open mind, and please go out and look at the research on this, because it's the research that, rather than our own experiences, which we should always turn to when we want to do what's truly best for students. So, I'm going to talk today about the myth of the reading level. Reading levels are very common in education, and they come from a really genuine desire of educators and parents to be able to describe in an easy way how a student is doing in reading. Here's the problem. There really isn't such a thing as a reading level, for a couple of different reasons. First, reading is made up of many different skills, and each of those skills could be at different levels. So when you get an estimation of a reading level from a text, from a teacher, from a tutor, or even from me, if you ask me what level your student's reading at, I will give you an estimation, best I can. What we're really looking at is the different skills that make up reading and sort of what is the average of those different skills. Can we look at them and sort of generalize what level a student might be reading at? In reality, each of those skills can be at a different level, and understanding what level each of those skills is at is far more useful than thinking about reading as a reading level. Now, there are some evidence-based ways that have been created as an attempt to get at this idea of a reading level. One is a lexile level. A lexile level does not speak to how easy it is to read a book, though. A lexile level speaks to comprehension. It's a measure of how complex a text is to comprehend that text. Oral reading fluency levels also can be used as a reading level of sorts, but these are really giving you a decoding level. Tests like Dibble's 8th will give students passages that are normed for different grade levels, and if you are meeting the criteria for benchmark at a 5th grade level, that means that on that oral reading fluency passage, you are decoding at a 5th grade level. You are reading at a rate and accuracy that meets the 5th grade level. When you look at the overall benchmark tests, they do also include some comprehension in there and use a formula to estimate whether a student can be at risk for reading difficulties. But again, I would caution, don't think of this specifically as a reading level. And even when a student can do really well on oral reading fluency, there are some rare but absolutely real disabilities and other factors which can make oral reading fluency not be predictive of comprehension. Usually it's very predictive, but at other times there are students out there who can read fluently and accurately and not comprehend. Again, that's the subject for another video. There's also DRA and Fountas-Pinnell levels. DRA stands for Diagnostic Reading Assessment. Most schools in the United States used these until relatively recently, and there are still schools that use them. And these levels, if you followed my channel or if you follow the research, are rather problematic. The reason is that the early levels in DRA and Fountas-Pinnell are based on an old idea of reading, which says that we don't actually sound out every word. We look at the pictures, we use the context, we look at the shape of the word in order to guess what that word might be. I would argue that there is some value in some of the later Fountas-Pinnell and DRA levels, especially as an interesting way to think about comprehension. But those early levels measure whether a student can read using a strategy, ultimately guessing at words from context, that is actually harmful. We do not want to rely on these levels, and there is no research or evidence supporting them In fact, to the contrary, thinking about reading in this way can be a rather dangerous path to go down, because these levels are just not supported by science, and the early ones can teach kids some actually quite bad habits about reading. So what do we do? Rather than thinking about reading levels, I'm going to make an argument to you. There are two kinds of reading that students should do in order to progress in their reading. One is decodable text. Early on, we want to be reading out loud to students most of what they hear for comprehension, because they're not able to read it yet. We use decodable text to reinforce independent comprehension, but also mostly, because they're not always great stories, to teach decoding. A decodable text should focus on a particular spelling pattern or a particular sound, or maybe a particular level of complexity in phonemic awareness. And it's designed to help students become automatic with their decoding. Remember that we want decoding to be easy and automatic, and decodable text focuses on giving students enough repetition of a particular pattern to help them get there. Equally, as students become able to, we want to continue with decodable text for new patterns to give them that controlled practice where they're getting that pattern over and over again. But more and more, we also want them to be reading uncontrolled text, which means books. Uncontrolled text is where students are going to get access to those complex sentences, those vocabulary words, and all of those features of reading which are really going to be the basis of their oral reading, of their oral language comprehension skills, not oral reading, sorry, and also of their ability to just access and to create complex language. We know that when students read, their vocabulary and their ability to use language grows at an enormous rate. And when students don't, it's a huge handicap that ultimately creates problems for them in every subject area, because they don't have the vocabulary to comprehend it. And because of this, there's a temptation in education to give students what's called a just right level. One way to do this is you hold up 10 fingers. Every time a student gets a word wrong, you put a finger down. If you put down more than 2 fingers in 10 words, that's considered not that student's just right level. I want to push back against this idea. When we look at what we would call a just right level, what we're really doing is giving students a text that is going to be fairly easy for them, or maybe a little bit challenging, but not too challenging. And what that's going to do is it will give them some of that language and vocabulary, but it's going to be a good level for practicing fluency, how quickly and easily they can read, because they don't have to think as much about the comprehension piece. And they don't have to think as much about sounding out the words when they're getting most of them right without putting much effort in. That being said, what the research shows, and what I've also seen in my personal practice, is that students can actually grow much more if they're reading a complex text that is above their just right level, as long as a couple of things are true. And keep this in mind, these things have to be true. The first is how motivated the student is. If a student is really motivated to read a book, even if that book is hard, my advice to parents is always the same. As long as they're not guessing the words, as long as they're actually using their strategies and sounding the words out, let them read it. They will make more growth and they will spend more time in front of it, and because they are motivated and they want to read it, the effort will be there. They will work through it. If, though, they're just rushing or guessing, don't let them read that one. That one is going to reinforce bad habits. But so long as they're using their strategies and really using their best reading and thinking, absolutely go for it. Also, when we're dealing with text that we're going to read with students, where we can support the comprehension with pictures, with articles, with background knowledge, with all kinds of things, we also can present text that is more complex. We actually want to get to where we're presenting text that is relatively complex and challenging for students without being frustrational and overwhelming, because that's where we're going to get the most growth. the more complex and challenging the text is, though, the more we have to be willing to step in as adults and provide supports, especially if it's not a text that students are motivated to read. So when we talk about just right text, what we're really talking about is text for a very specific purpose, helping build fluency and helping reinforce those decoding skills that students have at a level that's not going to be too challenging. And if students are not wanting to read and are not able to have an adult with them when they read, that's not a bad way to go about independent reading. But if your student wants to read something that is above that just right level, and or you're going to do it with them and can provide a lot of support. And I still think that student motivation is one of the most important things. Try not to make your kids listen to or read things that they really don't want to read. That is where the most growth is going to happen. Complex text is better than just right text, so long as we've got enough motivation and enough support so that the student is able to access it. So next time you think about reading levels, remember, a reading level is really just a guess. It's an average, or it's an idea from that particular test in the particular way that it measures reading, or the particular skills in reading that it measures. Reading levels are actually much more complicated and don't really exist because different skills can be at different levels. And we don't want to confine kids to certain reading levels. If your student wants to read a text that is challenging and wants to apply their skills and really do their best with that text, let them do it. They will make more growth. I have seen a sufficiently motivated student accomplish amazing things in incredibly complex text. Thank you all for watching. Let me know. Let me know if you disagree with me. I'm happy to talk about this more. As always, if you know somebody who's struggling, please check out my site, yourdyslexiaexpert.com. I will also link Dr. Ginsberg's Reading Simplified. I think that for students who are not yet decoding, that we just want to get to decoding, it can be a really useful approach. I also would say too, post anything that you want to know about reading. Why is this word spelled this way? What do I do when my student does this? I'm happy to help. Thank you very much. Bye.